It really is quite something. A state banquet kitchen at 6 in the morning. I should stop myself saying that because I have stood in this kitchen for 31 years and I still find myself pausing at the door some mornings, just for a second, just to take it in before the noise begins. The long stainless steel counters running the full length of the lower ground floor. The copper pans hanging in rows so precise they look ceremonial. The cold larder on the left, the pastry section at the far end behind its glass partition, the fish station nearest the garden door because Harold Sims, my pastry chef of 14 years, always said the smell of fresh fish should have somewhere to escape to. He was not wrong about that. He is rarely wrong about anything, which makes him extremely difficult to argue with. And believe me, in 31 years I have tried. My name is Raymond Ashworth. I have been head chef of the Royal Household Kitchens at Buckingham Palace since 1993. I have cooked for presidents, for prime ministers, for heads of state from 47 countries. I have navigated dietary restrictions that would make a lesser man weep. I once prepared a 7-course state dinner during a gas pressure failure in the main range, using 6 portable induction units, and what I can only describe as a controlled and sustained act of professional willpower. I tell you all of this not to impress you, because if you work in a professional kitchen, you will know that the moment you believe you have seen everything, the kitchen will very quickly and very efficiently prove you wrong. I tell you this so that you understand the weight of what I am about to say. The most instructive morning I have spent in 31 years of royal service was the morning a 10-year-old boy walked through my kitchen door and asked why we were not using the garden. But we will get to that. The date was a Tuesday in early November. The occasion was a state banquet in honor of the visiting president of a major European nation. 160 guests seated in the ballroom above us. The table set the previous afternoon by a team of 12 using a measuring ruler to ensure every piece of cutlery sat exactly level with the edge of the cloth. I have seen that table laid. It takes 4 hours. The precision of it is, in its own way, as impressive as anything we do below stairs. Every glass at exactly the right angle. Every flower arrangement verified against a diagram prepared 3 weeks in advance. Upstairs, by the time those guests sit down, everything looks inevitable, as though it could not possibly have been any other way. Downstairs, we know what it costs to make it look that way. We always know. By 6:15 that morning, my team of 22 chefs was in position. The menu had been approved 6 weeks prior by the master of the household, cross-referenced with the dietary requirements of all 160 guests, reviewed for allergens, reviewed again for the sustainable sourcing commitments the palace had made publicly the previous year, and then reviewed a third time by me, standing alone in this kitchen on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of cold tea, because that is simply what you do when the stakes are this particular. The centerpiece of the main course was a pan-roasted fillet of sustainably certified line-caught sea bass, with a bisque made from the prawn shells, heritage carrots from a farm in Lincolnshire, and a herb oil pressed from lemon thyme and flat-leaf parsley, sourced, like everything on that menu, from suppliers who had signed the palace's new sustainability charter. It was, on paper, a perfect menu. I remember looking at it that morning and thinking, and I am not a superstitious man, I want to be clear about that, I remember thinking that it looked almost too clean, too resolved. In 31 years, the menus that look most resolved on paper are frequently the ones that require the most improvisation in practice. I was not wrong, but I am getting ahead of myself. Because before the crisis, before the garden, before the moment that changed the way I think about this kitchen and what it is capable of, before all of that, there was the boy. He arrived at 7:45. I had been told he was coming. I had been told in the way one is often told things in royal service, a brief note, factual, no elaboration. Prince George would be spending the morning in the kitchens as part of an ongoing interest in food, sustainability, and the operational side of the household. He was to be treated, the note said, as a working observer. No fuss. He had requested, specifically, no fuss. He came through the side entrance off the corridor, the one the delivery teams use, not the ceremonial entrance that visiting dignitaries sometimes peer through when they are being shown the workings of the palace. He was wearing dark trousers, a white shirt with the collar open, and he had a small notebook tucked under his arm, a real one, paper, with a pen clipped to the cover. He looked, standing at the top of the 3 steps that lead down into the main kitchen, like someone who was trying very hard to arrive quietly, and was simultaneously aware that arriving quietly in a room of 22 professional chefs, who all know exactly who you are, is not entirely possible. The kitchen went, just for a moment, a fraction quieter than it had been. Not silent. A professional kitchen is never silent when it is running, but there was a quality of attention that shifted, just briefly, like a change in air pressure before weather arrives. George noticed it. He looked down at his notebook, then back up at the room, and then he did something that I have thought about many times since. He nodded. Not a wave, not a self-conscious smile. A single, small, composed nod, the kind of acknowledgement that says, "I see you, I am not here to disrupt you, and I understand that you have work to do." It was the nod of someone who had been taught, very carefully, what a room full of working people looks like, and how to enter one without making it about yourself. I walked across to meet him. "Chef Ashworth," he said, firm handshake, eye contact. "Good morning, sir," I said. "Welcome to the engine room." He looked around the kitchen slowly, taking it in properly, the way a person looks at something they intend to remember, and he said, "It's bigger than I expected, and louder." "It gets louder," I told him. He opened his notebook to the first page. At the top, in careful handwriting, he had written, "Things I want to understand, not just see. Understand." I decided then that this was going to be a different kind of morning. I have a rule in my kitchen. Everyone who enters it, regardless of who they are, regardless of what title they carry above stairs, is introduced to every section and every person working that section before they are given a single task. This is not protocol. It is not ceremony. It is practicality. A kitchen is a system of human beings, and you cannot operate inside a system you have not been shown. I have explained this to visiting journalists, to culinary students on placement, to at least 2 junior members of the household who expected to be handed a tasting spoon and stood near the good light for a photograph. The rule applies to everyone. I applied it to George. We moved through the kitchen section by section, and I introduced him to each chef in turn, using their name and their role in that order. Because in my kitchen, what a person does comes before who they are, and who they are is determined entirely by how well they do it. First, Marcus Webb, 38 years old, saucier, responsible that morning for the bisque, 4 reduction sauces, and a consommé that had been clarifying since 5:30. Marcus has the focused intensity of a man who is always listening for a liquid to reach the precise moment before it goes too far. He shook George's hand without looking up from his pan, which is not rudeness. It is the highest form of professional respect, because it means he trusts that you understand why he cannot look up from his pan. "How do you know when a reduction is right?" George asked him. Marcus did look up then, briefly. "When it coats the back of a spoon without running," he said, "but also when it smells like it means it." He went back to his pan. George wrote something in his notebook. Next, Priya Anand, 41, guard manger, the cold section, responsible for the starters that morning, a pressed terrine of heritage beetroot with a goat's cheese mousse and micro-herbs. Priya is meticulous in the way that only cold section chefs can be, because cold food has nowhere to hide. There is no heat to correct a mistake, no sauce to absorb an error. What you put on that plate in the cold section is exactly what the guest receives. Priya knows this. You can see it in how she works, every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. "How many portions are you doing?" George asked her. 160, she said, plus 16 covers for dietary variants, plus 8 backup portions of each variant in case of error. So you're making more than you'll ever use. Every time, she said. In a kitchen like this one, waste prevention and overpreparation are the same thing. George wrote that down too. I noticed he was not writing quotes, he was writing questions. The page I glimpsed was full of things beginning with why and how and what happens if. Then Harold Sims, pastry, 53 years old, the longest-serving member of my current team after me, and the reason our dessert section has the reputation that it does. Harold is a large man with very small handwriting and the patience of someone who has spent 3 decades waiting for things to set, to prove, to cool, to crystallize. He was working on the dessert that morning, a dark chocolate and salted caramel tart with a compressed pear, and a tuile so thin you could read through it if you held it to the light. "Do you always make the tuile that thin?" George asked him. Harold held one up to the overhead light. You could see the shadow of his fingers through it. "Thinner," he said, "and it breaks. Same thickness and it's just right. A little thicker and it's a biscuit. I have been making it this thin for 14 years and it has never been a biscuit." George looked at the tuile for a long moment. "How do you know exactly how thin is thin enough?" "You don't," Harold said, "until you do, and then you always do." He set the tuile down with the care of someone placing something irreplaceable. That's what 14 years buys you. And finally, the person I had decided before George arrived would be his guide for the morning. Clara Mendez, 28 years old, youngest sous chef in the history of my kitchen, which I say not as flattery but as a statement of fact that she earned in front of me over 4 years of extraordinary, focused, sometimes infuriating work. Clara is the kind of chef who asks why something is done a certain way before she learns to do it that way, which at first can make teaching her a challenge, and then, almost without your noticing, makes her better than you expected her to be. I had chosen Clara for a specific reason. She still remembered not knowing things. Some chefs, when they reach a certain level of competence, forget what it felt like to stand in a kitchen and understand nothing. Clara had not forgotten. I could see it every time a new commis arrived, the way she explained things not from above, but from alongside. "Clara will be with you this morning," I told George. "She'll tell you what's happening at each stage and give you tasks you can actually do. You are here to work, not to watch. Is that understood?" "Yes, chef," he said. Clara looked at him with the measured professional assessment she gives everyone on their first morning. Then she said, "Can you julienne a carrot?" He said he wasn't sure. "Good," she said. "Honest answer, let's find out." A state banquet kitchen runs on time the way a clock runs on tension. Every mechanism dependent on every other, the whole thing keeping perfect rhythm right up until the moment something slips. My job, on a banquet morning, is less about cooking and more about architecture. I am building a structure of time. The cold starters must be plated and held at precisely 4 degrees by 12:15. The fish, 160 portions of sea bass, must go into the pans in coordinated waves, 6 pans running simultaneously across 3 stations, beginning at precisely 7 minutes past 1, so that the last plate leaves the pass at no later than 1:22. Because from the pass to the ballroom above is 4 minutes, and the guests will be seated and waiting, and a state banquet does not ask the guests to wait. George was given his first task at 8:30. Clara set him at the prep station beside the herb section, a long wooden board, a small paring knife, and a bundle of flat-leaf parsley the size of a bouquet. His job was to pick the leaves from the stems, discard nothing but the thick lower stalks, and keep the leaves in a single consistent pile. A simple task, a necessary one. In my kitchen, there are no decorative tasks. Everything a person does feeds into something that will eventually reach a plate. Worked quietly, methodically. I noticed because I notice everything in that kitchen. It is a professional habit I cannot switch off, that he matched his pace to the rhythm of the room rather than to his own instinct, which in a child of 10 is not common. Most people, when placed inside a working kitchen for the first time, Either speed up because they are nervous or slow down because they are overwhelmed. George calibrated. Within 15 minutes he had found a pace that was, if not fast, entirely steady. The pile of parsley leaves grew in a clean and organized heap. Clara checked his work at 8:55. She turned the pile over, examined the stems he had discarded, looked for bruising on the leaves. "Good," she said. "Not fast, but good. Fast comes later." "How much later?" he asked. "Depends how much you care," she said, and then she moved him to the next task. The running of the morning settled into its familiar shape. Deliveries were checked against manifests by the kitchen porter, Daniel Osei, a man of immense practical intelligence who has been cross-referencing delivery notes against purchase orders for 11 years, and has never, in 11 years, accepted a short delivery without a phone call and a formal written record of the discrepancy. Stocks were tasted and adjusted. Marcus's bisque reached its first reduction and was set aside. Priya began pressing the terrine portions from their molds, and the cold section filled with the deep, earthy smell of beetroot, the kind of smell that is simultaneously ancient and precise. At 9:45, George was moved to the fish station, where he was given the task of counting and logging the sea bass portions as they came from the cold store. Each fillet had to be checked against the delivery manifest, weight within a 5% tolerance, skin intact, no browning at the edges. He stood with a clipboard that was nearly as wide as his shoulders and worked through the fillets one by one, calling each weight to Clara, who checked it against the sheet. It was here that the running gag found him for the first time. The amuse-bouche, a single spoonful of smoked salmon mousse on a buckwheat blinny, topped with the smallest possible amount of caviar, had been plated in test form by the garnish chef, Sophie Reeves, for approval before full production began. Sophie had set a row of 12 test portions on a tray at the end of the pass and gone to find me for the tasting. George, working at the station nearest the pass, looked at the tray. He looked at it for what I am told was approximately 4 seconds. He picked up a spoon. Harold, passing behind him with a tray of tart cases, said, without stopping, without altering his pace by a single step, "That is not for you." George put the spoon down. Harold did not look back. George picked up his clipboard. Clara, from across the station, was smiling at her cutting board. She said nothing. Some lessons are better absorbed than explained. By 11 o'clock, the kitchen had reached what I privately call the second gear, the hour when preparation gives way to assembly, when the individual components begin to find their relationship to each other on the plate. It is the most beautiful part of a banquet morning and also the most unforgiving, because at this point, what is not ready cannot be made ready in time. Every decision made in the 6 hours prior to 11 o'clock is now fixed. You are, from this point, working only with what you have. I did a round of all stations at 11:15. Clara's report on George, focused, asked useful questions, had not slowed any section down. She said this last part with a slight air of surprise that she was professional enough not to fully conceal. I was pleased. I did not say so, because in a banquet kitchen on the morning of service, pleasure is not an operational state. Then at 11:47, my telephone rang. It was the supplier, Thomas Hargreaves and Sons, sustainable seafood certified family business out of Cornwall, suppliers to the palace for the past 3 years. The voice on the line was not Thomas Hargreaves. It was his son, William, 26 years old, and the quality of his silence before he spoke told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. The delivery vehicle had been in an accident on the A303 that morning. Not serious, no injuries, and I asked that first always, but the refrigeration unit had failed on impact, and the entire secondary delivery had been compromised. The primary delivery, the 160 fillets of sea bass already in my cold store, already counted, already logged by a 10-year-old prince with a clipboard, was intact and unaffected. But the delivery also contained something else. something I had not flagged to my team as critical because it had appeared on paper to be straightforward. 60 portions of the heritage herb accompaniment, specifically fresh lemon thyme, not dried, not the commercial variety, the specific heritage cultivar, Thymus citriodorus, grown on a small plot in Wiltshire by a woman named Janet Pollock who had been supplying it to the palace for 8 months, and whose lemon thyme had a quality of fragrance that I had, on first tasting, described in my kitchen notes as irreplaceable. It was the cornerstone of the herb oil. Without it, the herb oil was a different thing. Without the herb oil, the sea bass dish was technically still a dish, but it was not the dish that had been approved, the dish the menu described, the dish that 60 of my 160 guests were expecting as their main course. I set the phone down. I stood for a moment at the pass. In 31 years, I have learned that a crisis in a kitchen has a shape. It arrives with a specific pressure, a specific narrowing of the available options, and the correct response to it is not panic. Panic is a luxury no professional kitchen can afford, but stillness. A deliberate, focused stillness in which you assess exactly what you have, exactly what you need, and exactly how large the gap between those two things actually is. The gap that morning was significant. I called Marcus. I called Clara. I called Sophie. I did not make an announcement to the full kitchen because a state banquet kitchen requires that the people not directly involved in a crisis continue their work as though no crisis exists, because the crisis is always, in my experience, in one section, and the solution must not disrupt the other sections that are functioning perfectly. We stood at the end of the pass. I explained the situation in 45 seconds. Marcus immediately proposed a substitution, commercial lemon thyme from our dry stores. I told him I had considered it and rejected it. The fragrance profile was insufficient. The dish would be technically compliant but qualitatively wrong, and at a state banquet, technically compliant is not good enough. Clara proposed a complete redesign of the herb oil, abandoning the lemon thyme entirely and building a new oil from the flat-leaf parsley and tarragon we had in abundance. Technically, this was possible. The timing was not. Pressing and infusing a new herb oil from scratch required 2 hours we did not have. Sophie, who is the most lateral thinker in my kitchen, a quality I value enormously and find alternately inspiring and maddening, suggested we contact Janet Pollock directly and ask whether there was any possibility of an emergency supply from her Wiltshire plot. I had already done the mathematics on this. The drive from Wiltshire, in late morning traffic, would take 2 hours and 20 minutes at minimum. Service began in 1 hour and 50. We stood in silence for a moment that felt, I will tell you honestly, considerably longer than it was. It was Clara who noticed that George was not at his station. This is the point at which, in most crisis narratives, someone becomes anxious about where the child has gone. I will tell you that in a working kitchen, a missing person, regardless of age, is a practical concern before it is an emotional one. A kitchen is not a safe environment for someone who does not know where to stand and when to move. I looked toward the herb section where he had been working. The clipboard was there. The pen was there. George was not. Marcus spotted him first. He was standing at the far end of the kitchen, near the garden door. The door herald always insisted be left slightly ajar during service for the ventilation of the fish station. He was standing with his nose approximately 3 centimeters from the glass panel in the door, looking out at whatever lay beyond it with an expression of concentrated curiosity. I walked down to him. He heard me coming and turned around, and he had the look of someone who has found something and is not yet certain whether finding it is going to be welcome news. "Chef Ashworth," he said, "what's out there?" I looked through the glass. Beyond the door was a narrow service passage, and beyond that, partially obscured by a low stone wall and what had once been a trellis and was now a trellis in advanced retirement, was a walled garden, rectangular, perhaps 40 meters by 20, enclosed on all 4 sides by the kind of brick wall that, in London, suggests Victorian construction and considerable expense. The beds inside it were overgrown but not abandoned. There was a structure to the growth, the ghost of organized rows beneath the weeds. I knew the garden existed. In 31 years, I had known it existed in the way that one knows many things that are not immediately operationally relevant, as a fact stored and seldom retrieved. The palace-walled kitchen garden, decommissioned in 2012 when the last head gardener who had managed it retired, and the decision was made not to replace the position. The beds had been left in a managed state, periodically cut back, not allowed to go entirely wild, but not cultivated. Not producing. That's the old kitchen garden, I told him. It hasn't been used in about 11 years. He looked at it for another moment, then he said, "Why not?" I gave him the answer I had: staff, maintenance cost, the decision made above my pay grade. And as I said it, I was simultaneously aware of how thin it sounded when spoken aloud in this particular context. "Has anyone looked at what's still growing in there?" he asked. I did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was no. The garden had been closed, and in the way of things that are closed, it had also been stopped. In 31 years, I had walked past that door every working day, and I had never opened it. George opened it. He pushed the garden door open, stepped into the service passage, and walked to the low gate in the stone wall. The gate was not locked. He pushed it open too. He walked into the garden. I followed him. The beds were overgrown but identifiable, you could see, if you knew what you were looking at, the organized structure beneath. Old fruit canes along the north wall. What had been a brassica section? A long bed that had once clearly been an herb bed. The growth was still partially organized, self-seeded perennials coming back year after year with no one to harvest them. George walked along the herb bed slowly, bending down every few steps to look more closely. I walked beside him. The morning air was cold and very still, the noise of the kitchen entirely absent out here. I was thinking about the crisis. I was thinking about 160 covers and a herb oil with no herb. I was thinking about 31 years and whether this was the morning they ended. George stopped. He crouched down. He picked a small leaf from a low-growing plant, silvery green, small and pointed, growing in a dense sprawling mat along the front edge of the bed. He held it up to me. "What's this?" he said. I took it. I crushed it between my fingers. The fragrance was immediate and extraordinary. Lemon. Clean and high and precise, the way lemon smells before it becomes complicated by anything else. Unmistakable. The specific, irreplaceable fragrance of Thymus citriodorus. Heritage lemon thyme. Growing in the palace kitchen garden, unattended, unnoticed, self-seeded and spreading quietly for 11 years while we ordered it from Wiltshire and drove it up the A303. I stood up, I looked at the bed. It ran the full length of that section, perhaps 8 meters, more than enough, more than twice enough. I looked at George. He was watching me with the same steady, composed attention he had brought through the kitchen door that morning. Not triumphant, not performing discovery, just watching with the careful patience of someone who has asked a question and is waiting without urgency to understand the answer. I said, and I want to be precise about this because I have replayed it many times, I said, we need to harvest this, right now, all of it that's ready. He stood up, opened his notebook and wrote something. Then he said, I'll get Clara. What followed was 35 minutes of the most focused harvesting I have ever supervised. Clara came out with 3 of the prep team. George worked alongside them, not symbolically, not decoratively, but actually on his knees in the cold soil of a November garden, cutting sprigs of lemon thyme with a small pair of kitchen scissors that Sophie had brought from the garnish station. He did not need to be shown twice how to cut above the woody stem to encourage regrowth. He did not need to be told to keep the harvested sprigs away from the damp ground. He understood, from a morning of watching professionals work, that the handling of an ingredient between the ground and the plate was not incidental. It was part of the cooking. By 12:40, we had harvested sufficient lemon thyme for 80 portions of herb oil, 60 required, 20 in reserve. Marcus pressed the oil in 2 batches. The fragrance it produced was, and Marcus is not a man who uses superlatives readily. He is a man who says correct when something is exactly right and nothing more. Marcus pressed the oil, held the jar to the light, smelled it, and said, "This is better than what we had before." He was right. The thyme growing in that garden had 11 years of undisturbed root development, the kind of deep soil relationship that cultivated crops often lack. It was more concentrated, more itself. Priya, plating the starters at 1 o'clock, passed the garden door on her way to the cold store and looked through the glass at the now partially harvested bed. She stopped for a moment. She said to nobody in particular, "We've been walking past that every day." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The fish went into the pans at 7 minutes past 1. 160 portions, in coordinated waves, 6 pans at 3 stations, the kitchen reaching the particular intensity of the final 30 minutes before service. The heat, the focus, the choreography of 22 people moving within a space designed for 12, each one knowing exactly where they are supposed to be and moving without hesitation. George stood at the far end of the pass with Clara, out of the direct line of movement, watching. His notebook was open. He was not writing. The second encounter with Harold occurred at 1:15, when the dessert tuiles, fragile, brilliant, impossibly thin, were being transferred from the cooling rack to the service trays. George, stepping back from the pass to allow a porter through, found himself standing directly beside the dessert section. Harold was lifting tuiles one at a time with the kind of instrument that looks like it belongs in surgery. George looked at the tuiles. Harold, without looking up, said, "Still not for you." George's mouth, which had been open, closed. Sophie, from across the section, laughed. A real laugh, the kind that breaks through professional composure and is all the more welcome for it. Clara turned away to hide a smile. Marcus, who had heard it, said nothing, but his shoulders moved once in a way that suggested he had heard it. The last plate left the pass at 1:21, 45 seconds ahead of schedule. I do not, as a rule, mark the moment of service with any ceremony. In 31 years, I have learned that the moment a plate leaves this kitchen is the moment our work passes into the hands of others, the service team, the ballroom, the rhythm of the meal itself. And the correct response to that handover is to immediately begin preparing the kitchen for the next phase. There is always a next phase. There is always clearing and checking and recording, and the long, methodical work of bringing a kitchen back to the state in which it is ready to begin again. But that afternoon I paused. I paused because I was standing near the garden door, and through the glass I could see the herb bed, the newly harvested rows, the cut stems, the evidence of those 35 minutes in November cold that had solved a problem I had not known was solvable. And I paused because George was standing beside me, his notebook closed now, tucked back under his arm, and he was looking through the same glass at the same garden with an expression I recognized, the particular expression of someone who has just understood something they will not forget. I spoke to him then, not as a head chef to a junior, not as a royal servant to a member of the family, as one person who had spent a morning in a kitchen to another. "Do you know what you did this morning?" I asked him. He thought about it. He did not answer immediately, which I had come to understand over the course of that morning was how he operated. He did not produce answers quickly. He produced them carefully. I asked why the garden wasn't being used, he said. "That's right. But you knew the garden was there." "I did. So why didn't you ask?" And there it was. The question I had been asking myself since 12:40, since Marcus pressed the oil, since the last plate left the pass. The question that had no comfortable answer and deserved none. "Because," I said, "in 31 years I learned where everything was. And somewhere in that learning, I stopped looking for things I hadn't already found. He considered this for a long moment. Through the glass, the November garden was quiet and still, the cut herb bed already beginning, in its slow botanical way, to set about the business of growing back. Clara appeared beside us. She had a clipboard service report to be completed before the kitchen closed, and she stood for a moment looking through the glass alongside us before she spoke. "I want to put a proposal together," she said, "for reopening the garden properly. A dedicated section for the kitchen. Heritage varieties, the ones that don't travel well, the ones we keep trucking in from 50 miles away because we assume we can't grow them here." She paused. "We can grow them here, we just weren't." Harold arrived, as Harold always arrives, without announcing himself. He stood at the edge of the group, drying his hands on his whites, and looked through the glass at the garden with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he understood. "The time's been in that bed for over a decade," he said, "self-seeded from the original planting. You know what that means botanically." Nobody answered. "It means the garden never actually stopped," he said. "We stopped. The garden just kept going without us." Priya had come for the clipboard Clara was holding and found herself standing in a small group at the garden door instead. She looked at the bed. She looked at the group. She said, in the practical way Priya says most things, "We should catalog what else is in there before the winter sets in. There may be more we don't know about." George wrote that down. He wrote it in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who knows the difference between noting something and understanding it. The handwriting of someone who came into this kitchen that morning with a page that said things I want to understand, not just see, and who was, I think, beginning to understand that the two are not separate activities but a single continuous one. That to truly see a thing is to ask why it is there, and to ask why it is there is to begin, already, to understand it. I looked at what he had written. It was not a quote, it was a question the same as all the others. If the garden kept going without us, what else have we been walking past? I did not answer him. Some questions are not for answering. Some questions are for carrying into the next morning and the morning after, and the 31 years after that, in whatever form those years eventually take. The kitchen was clean by 4 o'clock, the formal report filed by 4:30. The garden door, which had been propped open for the harvest and left that way in the aftermath, was still open when I made my final walkthrough at 5. I did not close it. I do not know entirely why. Perhaps because it had been closed for 11 years and 1 day, and that seemed, all things considered, long enough. The proposal Clara had spoken about at the garden door was submitted to the master of the household 6 days later. It was approved, with a budget allocation, within the month. The first replanting of the walled kitchen garden began in February. Heritage lemon thyme, 12 varieties of culinary herb that do not transport well but grow, as it turns out, very capably in well-maintained Victorian brick-walled London soil. An espaliered apple section along the south wall. A cutting garden for the flowers that appear on the state banquet table above us, which until that point had been sourced from a supplier in the Netherlands and flown in 3 days before each event. George came back in March. He brought the same notebook. He had filled 2 more of them in the months between. He went straight to the garden. I watched him from the kitchen door, the boy in the cold spring morning, moving slowly along the new herb beds with his notebook open, crouching down at intervals to look more closely, to touch, to consider. The kitchen was running behind me, the familiar noise of it, the warmth of it, 22 people and the work they do every day. And I thought, standing at that door, between the kitchen and the garden, in the specific and ordinary and irreplaceable morning light of a Tuesday in March, I thought about what the book of Proverbs says. Not a king this time, not the stability of thrones, something quieter than that, something about a child leading, about where wisdom sometimes comes from and how it comes, and why we should not be surprised when it arrives wearing a white shirt with the collar open and carrying a paper notebook. asking the one question we never thought to ask. The garden kept going without us. It was waiting for someone to notice.